The assessment that I chose for this assignment was the Preschool Language Scale 5th edition, also known as PLS-5. So the purpose of the PLS-5 is to assess language development and identify children who have a language delay or disorder. And this test is done with children aged birth through 7 years and 11 months. The goal of the PLS-5 is to identify receptive, expressive language skills in different areas, such as attention, gesture, play, social communication, vocab, etc. And then based on the test results, the administrator, who is typically a speech and language pathologist, can determine strengths and weaknesses in the areas that I just mentioned. And then this will help determine the presence and type of a language disorder, and then the services that the child is eligible for. There are two standardized scales for the PLS-5. They are auditory comprehension and expressive communication. Auditory comprehension is used to evaluate the scope of a child's comprehension language, and expressive communication is used to determine how well a child communicates with others. The most common reason for administering the PLS-5 is if the child is nonverbal. The test can also be administered if the child has a hard time communicating with others or has limited vocabulary. Lack of eye contact is also a very common reason to have this test done as well. One of the biggest benefits of this test is how it's administered. It is administered to the children as though they are just playing because of the age range that this services. Children do much better with a more play-based administration of the test rather than trying to have them sit and take a written or oral conversation. They just don't have the attention span. So they have different cards that they have to identify objects. There's a lot of different sensory components to this assessment, which I think for this age range is definitely necessary. Current research of the PLS-5 does, however, state that the validity of this assessment is lacking for several reasons. And there is actually a lot of cultural bias within this test. For example, one of the parts of the test, they show a picture of a frog, and the child has to either say it's a frog or make the noise that a frog makes, but there are some children who maybe they live in a city and they've never been exposed to a frog before, so they don't know what that is, so they can't vocalize that. There's several different examples of this throughout the PLS-5, and because it's a standardized test, it's the same exact test for every kid, so it doesn't matter where you live or what culture background you come from. Those are the pictures and objects that you are going to be seeing. Also, the clinical sample used in the manual used to determine sensitivity and specificity was subject to spectrum bias because only those individuals who were clearly language disordered or delayed were included in the sample. And then those who were not receiving, or those who were mildly delayed children or who were borderline, typically were excluded from this manual, and so the results were a little skewed in that way. Overall, I do agree with the research that I found and the lack of validity as well as the cultural bias. I think testing children this young can be super challenging, although it is definitely necessary sometimes. But they are still developing and changing at such a rapid rate, especially when it comes to language and vocabulary. And I do definitely think that the manual needs to add the results from children who were mildly delayed in the clinical sample, just to give a better understanding of the full picture and all the populations that it does serve. And then for my evaluation, I pretended that I evaluated a girl who was 5 years old and was in kindergarten, and she clearly, her vocab was definitely less than her peers, and she was really struggling to hold conversations, although she still had friends in her class and didn't really seem to notice that she was delayed in any way. So at the end, the recommendations were for her to see a speech language pathologist 2 times a week that would get reevaluated every 2 months, and to have constant meetings with parents to see what can be done at home and at school so everyone is on the same page.